Today I'm back with some more horror short stories for Horror Mayhem. Week 3 was classic horror and week 4 was contemporary horror, but because I had a quite busy few weeks, I decided to lump them together. And I actually decided to alternate between classic and contemporary and do some sort of battle. So one classic horror story and one contemporary horror story going head to head for 3 rounds. This is Michelle's Melancholia, where we read books to fear and shed a tear. Stick around if you want to find out who won. For the first round, I chose one more of Lovecraft's stories, compiled in this beautiful edition of the classic horror stories, and I wanted to go completely opposite in the contemporary direction. So I actually chose to read from a magazine where usually up-and-coming writers publish their stuff, and the magazine I chose for that was Ghoulish Tales, which is published, I believe, either quarterly or twice a year by Ghoulish, which is a small horror press. And they also have a bookshop in Texas, so people in the US, you may want to visit because it looks really cool. It's completely dedicated to horror. This magazine is really cool, although this is the first volume I dive into, but the publisher describes it as a celebration of all things spooky, and it includes both fiction and non-fiction, so there are a few essays there as well. I haven't read them, but I'd be happy to tell you what I think of them when I do. Back to the battle. The Lovecraft story I chose to read was The Horror at Red Hook, which was first published in 1925, and I chose this one because I think it's one of his most well-known stories. It's definitely one of his most famous, or dare I say infamous, so I wanted to find out what all the fuss is about. I've actually read Victor Laval's retelling, The Ballad of Black Tom, and I enjoyed that as a standalone, but I definitely think maybe it would have been a better experience if I had been familiar with the original story. So The Horror at Red Hook takes place in New York, and we mostly follow a policeman, or some kind of like investigator for police. And his job is to investigate a series of criminal activities that had been happening in an underprivileged area in New York called Red Hook, as well as the somewhat mysterious business practices of a man who definitely comes from a much more socially and economically privileged position, but he has been seen interacting with people from Red Hook, and basically the policeman's job is to find out what's going on. And without spoiling too much of the plot, I'll just say that what he finds out is that these people are involved in occult practices in a way that seems to suggest that they may be trying to summon something or someone from another dimension. Something like that. In typical Lovecraft fashion, things are never really spelled out. Everything is always shrouded in mystery, and we are supposed to know it's horrifying, but we never know exactly what is being summoned. The reason I say this story is quite infamous is because I had heard before that Lovecraft takes his fear of the unknown to an extreme, where this story comes across incredibly xenophobic and frankly horribly racist. And I knew that that was going to be in there, but honestly, I was not prepared to actually experience how explicitly and unashamedly racist this story is. The choice of words to describe people from non-white ethnicities, people who look different and speak other languages that are not English, were actually horrendous. And while I usually tend to read critically and obviously consider the context in which things were written without excusing it, of course, but just understanding the context, I think in this particular case I did feel that this hateful manner of speech detracted from the story. So I cannot say I enjoyed it. I didn't really enjoy the occult elements of it because I felt that they were genuinely only there as a justification for the racism, and I didn't think it was salvageable. The contemporary opponent in Ghoulish Books was a very short story, maybe 5 pages, 3 to 5 pages. It was titled Skulls and written by Jen Conley, and this was an excellent short story. It is about a boy that is out on a walk with his mom and his little brother, a little sibling, in an area where there's like a little patch of woods and a beach. So he is walking down the beach and he comes across a skull, something that looks like a bird skull. So he picks it up and he's quite entertained with his finding. And then a man approaches him, and this man looks, like a little bit disheveled, a little bit weird. And this boy starts recalling a story his friend told him about a serial killer living in that area. But the boy's thinking that surely this man is not him. And they get into a little conversation, and it's a very intriguing story because while this conversation is taking place, we are left to wonder, is this man a serial killer, or is he just like a normal, friendly man talking to a boy on the beach? It's really easy to spoil short stories, so I won't say anything else, but I loved everything about it. It had a great atmosphere, and the way the author chose to wrap it up was excellent. So Skulls was a great story, and I think it could have beaten many classic stories, but paired with Horror at Red Hook, which was horrendous, there was no doubt that Skulls was the winner of round 1. For round 2, I chose a classic horror story from this huge anthology called The Weird, a compendium of strange and dark stories. And I chose to read Casting the Runes by M.R. James, which was published in 1911. And this is about a mysterious man who submits an academic paper about alchemy to be published. And the editor of this journal is a curator at a museum. He's an authority in this subject, so to speak, and he decides that this manuscript he's been sent is complete hogwash, so it gets rejected. Of course, this is supposed to be done anonymously, but the man who submitted the manuscript is adamant that he wants to find out who rejected his paper. And we come to find out that it's important that he doesn't find out, because he has a reputation for being quite vengeful. And in the past, people who have crossed paths with him and have not treated him in the way that he thinks he deserves have ended up meeting terrible fates. So in the story, we follow this man, the journal editor, as he goes on a quest to make sure that he doesn't end up in that same situation. I really enjoyed this one. I'm not sure if I've read M.R. James before, maybe I have, but nothing comes to mind right now. But I enjoyed his writing style. It's definitely very old-fashioned, but I loved how he played out the story as a little mystery to solve with like a little quest. So there was tension. It wasn't particularly scary. It's just that its content is supernatural, but even though it wasn't scary, I found it very engaging and I was quite invested in what was gonna happen. For the contemporary story, I went back to Gemma Amor's latest short story collection called All Who Wander Are Lost, Destination Horror Stories, and I went with the very first story called There's Something in First Landing State Park. This is about a woman who has had something traumatic happen in her past. So as a way to get over this and cope with it, she's been traveling, and she finds herself traveling to the United States and going on a hike in a swampy area. And she and her friend, hiking companion, end up coming across a creature that lives in the swamp. This story leans almost eco-horror-y. It's some sort of creature feature, but one of those in which you can almost not fault the creature because it's the people encroaching on its living space. I enjoy Gemma's writing very much, so all of her descriptions of the swamp setting and the creature were spot on. She writes characters that to me are always very likable, very relatable, very real, and I always become somewhat attached to them. However, I think this story was much too long for what it was. The real action doesn't start until way into the story, and although I appreciated her writing about a woman that has gone through something traumatic and is trying to find herself again, I didn't really get how that related to the rest of the story, and I think it could have been done in a much more compact way. So I'm just not quite sure why the decision to include some aspects of the story was made. There's even like a whole chunk before we even get to the swamp. She starts off in the plane, and then she's in her hotel, and then there's like a bunch of stuff happening that I just don't know why she thought it was necessary to include. So I guess for round 2, I'd give the win to classic horror. For round 3, I wanted to choose a classic that was still a classic, but not quite so old. So I decided to go with something from this book, which is Daphne du Maurier's The Breaking Point, a collection of short stories. I had never read Daphne du Maurier before. I know that's kind of wild. I haven't read Rebecca. I will someday. And I didn't know if this was gonna work out because I know that not all of her stories are horror, but they tend to have some dark subject matter, or at least that's what the back of the book says. So I just went with the first one, which was called The Alibi, and it was really good. I don't think I'd say it's horror, but I'm gonna count it nevertheless. So the story is called The Alibi, and this whole collection is from 1959. And The Alibi is about this man who's just out on a walk with his wife. They're on the older side. I don't know if it's mentioned, but that's the impression I got, maybe in their 50s. And while this man is experiencing the complete normalcy of his life during this walk, he suddenly breaks. His brain breaks. He tells his wife to get on a taxi and go home, and he decides he's going to go and murder someone right now. So he starts walking down the streets looking for someone to murder, and he starts getting to like a more poor area of the city, and then he picks a random house, and then he goes up and knocks on the door, and a woman opens the door, and she had like a little child. But suddenly the man decides that instead of killing her right now, he's going to drag it out, and he says he's an artist looking for some studio space to paint, and he says, do you have any room I could give you money for? And she needs money, so she says yes. So the man gets a bunch of art supplies, and then he moves them into the studio, and then he just goes there for a few days, and he's planning to kill this woman. This story was so weird in a good way. Like, it's very uneventful. Aside from what I told you, there is not much going on except us like confusedly rolling around in this man's brain. But it's written in a really cool way because we follow this man and we feel like he's very much in control of the situation. It seems like he's calling the shots of what's gonna happen and how. And slowly but surely, we start to get this feeling, impression that something's gonna go wrong. We don't know exactly what or how. We just have this underlying feeling of tension and anxiety that things are not what they seem. Things are not gonna go as planned. And it's so subtle, but it's definitely there, and it kept me just wanting to keep flipping the pages to find out what was gonna happen. Obviously, I'm not gonna tell you what happens, but it's kind of confusing and sad, and definitely not where I thought we were gonna end up when the story starts. For the contemporary story, I went back to the Ghastling magazine, and I read Dead Stories by Gillinder. This is about a teenage boy who enjoys going to his local cinema to watch movies. And one day when he goes there, he's the only person in the room, and they start playing this obscure independent film from this director he's never heard from before. And it's kind of like an anthology of creepy stories, and as the movie progresses, these stories start to get more and more disturbing. So then he goes home and he can't get this movie out of his mind. But when he tries to research the director, nothing comes up. So then the next day he tries to go back to the cinema and ask the people there, and they don't know what he's talking about. He tries to find the ticket stop and it's gone. So it seems like this film never existed. In this way, it reminded me of this book, Joel Lane's The Witnesses Are Gone, in which there is also a film that it's questionable whether it actually exists or not. And I love that concept in stories. I find it so creepy. And then he starts having bad dreams related to the film, and it seems like this is also starting to bleed into his life when he's awake. This was a very good story. It was creepy, great atmosphere. I have nothing bad to say about it, but I thought that The Alibi was excellent. So Classic Horror wins round 3, which was also the tiebreak, so Classic Horror wins overall. I had an absolute blast during the last 2 weeks of Horror Mayhem, and actually during the whole month. So I just want to thank all the organizers for putting this together. I've been watching everyone's videos from a lot of people that have participated, and I just love horror getting so much love. Anyways, leave me a comment down below telling me if you prefer classic horror or contemporary horror, or anything you want to talk about. I'm always happy to read what you have to say, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!